Welcome to Forging Plowshares, a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom of God. We hope this part of our ongoing conversation stimulates your mind and challenges your heart about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Please stay tuned at the end of the podcast for a short message about our ministry.
This is Paul Axton, Director of Forging Plowshares and Plowshares Bible Institute. And in this sermon on Jesus' action in the temple, Jesus disrupts the sacrifices in the temple, and he echoes then the prophet Jeremiah in calling it a den of violent thieves. The idea is not simply that the institution is charging unfair rates. Jesus has no real interest in cleaning up Herod's temple. But the point is the institution itself is robbing people of their life. It shelters murder and violence as part of Jewish identity, and this is made clear then in the prophets. The driving out of the animals is not simply concerned with the financial exchange, but it's a symbolic ceasing of the sacrificial economy. The momentary saving of the animals from slaughter is a metaphorical end to the murder system, a metaphorical end to scapegoating sacrifice. And so in this action, I believe there is the sign that Jesus is displacing the violent religion of the temple and Israel with a new temple and a new kingdom. Forging Plowshares is a nonprofit ministry, and we greatly appreciate your donations, which allow us to continue our ministry of both Forging Plowshares and Plowshares Bible Institute. Plowshares Bible Institute is one of the most in-depth seminary educations available, and it's available to all. Donations can be made on the Outreach International website, oionline.org, through PayPal or Simple Give. We're only able to continue this ministry through these donations. So just choose our project number, FP3901, when donating. We hope you enjoy this sermon then on the end of the scapegoating sacrifice of the temple. Matthew 21:12-14. And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a robber's den." And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. Last week, we saw when asked for a sign, Jesus says he will only give the sign of Jonah. But then in the temple incident, in the version according to John, when asked, "By what sign do you show us your authority for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It took us 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" And then John adds the explanation, but he was speaking of the temple of his body. Both the sign of Jonah and this sign in the temple refer, of course, to his death and resurrection. Though in the temple, Jesus uses the active verb destroy to indicate the manner by which he would die. Both incidents are surrounded by violence. The violence of the sea and Jonah. The violence of the temple sacrifices. The violence of Nineveh. The violence of the Jews and Rome, which would kill Jesus. And it is this violence in both the sign of Jonah and the temple that accounts for his death. The sign of Jonah entails the anger of Jonah toward his enemies, which of course, as we saw last week, is duplicated in the Pharisaical anger turned on Jesus. and the same anger directed at protecting the temple. This is going to kill Jesus. So Jesus is very much, and he's echoing Jeremiah. You know, Jeremiah talked about the destruction of the temple, and the priests and the prophets, it says in Jeremiah 26:8, and all the people seized him and said, "You must die." And in this sign, Jesus ties his death to the threat he poses to the temple and all that it represents. His claim of the temple being a robber's den. It's not so much that bad people have corrupted a good system, but as in Jeremiah and Isaiah, the temple itself is behind the robbery. The English word robber here may not catch the meaning of the Greek and Hebrew term. The lestes, an armed thief who steals and he uses the threat of violence. So cleaning up this system, it's more than getting rid of the money changers. God in Jeremiah himself claims this institution is a den of robbers. And setting up the system of sacrifices, God says, was not his idea. In 7:5, it says in Jeremiah, I did not speak to your fathers or command them in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. It's not just that the money changers are charging unfair rates, but the temple is incurring a violent debt and making thieves of all who are involved in its operation. God describes it as a place of institutionalized murder. In 7:5, oppressing the alien, the orphan, the widow, and shedding innocent blood in this place. The issue is destruction of the entire system, displacement of the entire system, which Jesus intimates in saying, destroy this temple. Of course, he's talking about the temple of his body, but included in that is the idea, and Jesus describes this, the whole system's going to be destroyed. God says in Isaiah, I have had enough of burnt offerings, of rams, and the fat of fed cattle. And I take no pleasure in the blood of bulls, lambs, or goats, in Isaiah 1:11. In 1:14 he says, I hate your new moon festivals, your appointed feasts. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. He equates the system with murder. In 1:15, when you spread out your hands in prayer, I will hide my eyes from you. Yes, even though you multiply prayers, I will not listen because your hands are covered with blood. Now, we may tend to read these verses as saying, they're killers in spite of the temple. But what is being described is a system that is inherently violent. Now, obviously, in the slaughter of the animals, but also in producing scapegoating sacrifice. God says, bring your worthless offerings no longer. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath, the calling of assemblies, I cannot endure iniquity and your solemn assembly. And so Jesus is fulfilling this prophetic speaking against the temple. He disrupts the sacrifices in the temple. And he echoes Jeremiah, calling it a den of robbers. The institution is robbing people of their life. It shelters murder and violence as part of Jewish identity. And the driving out of the animals, it's not simply concerned with money, but it is a symbolic ceasing of the sacrificial economy. While Jesus is performing these actions in the temple, the whole thing is shut down momentarily. There's a momentary saving of the animals from slaughter as a kind of metaphorical end to this system. And during his action, Mark says he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. Some translations mistranslate this. They said they wouldn't let them carry merchandise. But it's not items for sale, but it's the words used are the same words as in Hebrews 9:21, all the vessels used in worship. So there's a whole paraphernalia necessary for the conduct of sacrifice. Shovels, barrels, buckets, bowls, pans. Anything used for ferrying the wood, the ashes, the oil, the grain cakes, the animal body parts, the peace offerings, Thanksgiving offerings, sacrifices. All those things described in Leviticus. Jesus was disrupting the entire system of the temple, of which the money changers they're one small part. The sellers and consumers, the patrons and priests, or all that are involved are interrupted. He symbolically halts the entire system. And of course, in his person, he makes the whole system obsolescent. This will cause his death. And that's what he says. He knows this. But of course, that's part of the point. So as to expose the violence at the heart of the system. The violence that was contained in the temple will be directed at Jesus. The violence that killed him and which he defeated in the cross and the resurrection is then a displacement of this system. And so the driving out of the animals, it clearly puts a direct focus on the sacrifices. But of course, everybody understood the animals are symbolic. The sacrificial victims Jesus is driving out of the temple, I believe they represent his sheep delivered from violent sacrifice. In the verse we read in Matthew, it seems to accentuate this point, that he, in the midst of this, heals the blind and the lame who came to him in the temple in the very midst of this incident. And of course, these are the very ones that are oppressed by the temple system. They couldn't find access to forgiveness. But Jesus opens a new way for these so-called sinners that the temple did not pretend to help. And listen to Jesus' words in John. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved, and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep in John 10. And so Jesus implicates all who were previously shepherding Israel. He says they were all thieves and robbers. It's a universal statement. But of course, the bandits, those who kill and destroy, the patrons, they're saved from the robbery of this death-dealing system in Christ. Now we know by the time John writes, probably long after 70 AD, there is no temple. It's been destroyed. the whole economy is long gone. But even in the synoptics, Jesus had provided a door out of the sacrificial economy and entry into an alternative kingdom. He says, I'm the door of the sheep. Maybe he's referring to that sheep gate in Jerusalem that accentuated. The reason people are bringing their sheep is to bring them to the temple. But Jesus is a new gate. Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. This shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, and he drives them from the deadly system to which they were subject. Halting the sacrifices. It also entails an implicit political dimension that involves Rome. We may not normally think about this, but we know that when Israel decided to cease offering sacrifices for Caesar in 66 AD, according to Josephus, he says this action laid the foundation of the war with the Romans. And we know the story, the Roman army is going to come in as a result in 70, destroy Jerusalem, millions of people are going to die, tear down the temple. And so literally it would take an army the size of the Roman army that would eventually destroy the temple to permanently halt these sacrifices. But of course, Jesus is symbolically halting the sacrifices. Same thing. The disruption produces a kind of sacrificial crisis of the sort that would eventually consume the temple and Israel. Now the priests and the Pharisees, they see this. They understand this possibility, and that's why in John 11:48 they say, if we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation, which they do. And Jesus' death, they were hoping, would ward off Rome's sacrifice of Israel. Israel has its own scapegoating sacrificial economy. And I think Christ is very aware that he's unleashing this kind of potential for unprecedented violence. The whole of archaic humanity, 1,000 years of Jewish religious history, culminating in this crisis in the Roman occupation, that's what's threatening. And the Jews momentarily forestall this. That's the whole issue on his trial. He said he would destroy this temple. But of course, Christ made provision for a new temple, for a new nonviolent way of being human, neither Roman nor Jewish. In most of the Gospels leading up into the action of the temple is combined with the triumphal entry. And it's clear the violent world of warring kingdoms attached to Israel and the temple, it's being halted by a new kind of king and a new kind of kingdom. In Zechariah 9:9, which is quoted, "Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So he comes riding in the triumphal entry and rides up, and then the temple incident. And this is not a king prepared for battle, but one equipped to end the sacrifices of war, the sacrifices of religion, the sacrifices of violence. The way he's described in Zechariah is the word ani, humble, poor, oppressed. Elsewhere in Job, the same word is used for a murder victim. In Deuteronomy, the same word is used in describing the victim, someone who has to give their coat in pledge. This humble and meek king does not come to sacrifice, but to halt sacrifice. And this is the passage that is quoted in Zechariah. "I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem, and the bow of war will be cut off, and he will speak peace to the nations, and his dominion will be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. This is the imagery Jesus is purposely echoing in his entry into Jerusalem and into the temple. Now, this is the same reason, that John the Baptist marks the end of this violent type of kingdom. In Matthew 11, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and violent men take it by force. And so John is the last in the line of those who, like Elijah, possess the kingdom, in a kind of alien fashion against the kingdom itself. The violence, the sacrificial economy of the temple, that's what we're talking about. The warring destruction of Israel. This isn't the kind of kingdom God wanted or that he would establish. This violent sort of kingdom is finished with Jesus. And in Mark, as they proceed into Jerusalem, he curses the fig tree. May no one ever eat fruit from you again. And he's saying this of the temple. He's saying this of the whole system. And then right after this, we have a passage that is misunderstood so often. He says that whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, that it could be so. Well, he's not talking about any prayer or any mountain. He's talking about the mount that the temple is on, that they can already live out their faith in its absence. And so the two incidents tied together, they explain. It's more intelligible that he's referring to this event, the withering of the fig tree, as a kind of parable of what will now happen to the temple and its sacrificial order. This tree can't bear any more fruit. The temple is finished. The system is finished. It can be discarded into the sea. The mountain Jesus is speaking of is the Temple Mount, and the movement is entry into a different form of forgiveness. That's what he's saying in that. No longer dependent on the ritual of sacrificial violence. So Jesus is himself the alternative to the temple, exposing its continual blood sacrifice and ongoing violence, made evident as that which sacrifices Jesus. He is sacrificed in an effort to preserve the temple, to preserve its deadly economy, and of course, in the process, he displaces the whole system. So the sign of Jonah and the sign of the temple, they stand against this scapegoating sacrifice. In the case of Jonah, the scapegoating sacrifice of Nineveh, and in the temple, the scapegoating sacrifice of the temple and of the entire system. Jesus knew that halting the sacrifices, it literally produces the sign of Jonah. It produces the destruction in his murder, the destruction of the temple of his body, and the resurrection. And this then is a defeat. It's an exposure of this order of violence and sacrifice. And so that's what the sign of Jonah, just as Jonah is 3 days in the earth, symbolically delivered from death. Jesus, the destroyed temple, is 3 days in Hades or hell, cleansing the world of hellish violence and providing new life, resurrection life, free of sacrificial violence in a new temple order.
Forging Plowshares is a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom by providing in-depth, transformative biblical and theological education and discipleship. If you have found this podcast valuable, please remember to share on social media. If you have questions about what you've heard, or if you'd like to learn more about how you can get involved with Forging Plowshares or even support this ministry financially, please visit our website, forgingplowshares.org.